The new Emir of Qatar says he will continue to follow the path set by his father, who abdicated the throne earlier this week. In his first televised address as head of state, the 33-year-old Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani praised the efforts of the outgoing Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani in transforming Qatar from a Persian Gulf backwater into a diplomatic, financial and energy powerhouse. And what a transformation it's been. Its oil and gas supplies has meant it now has the world's highest per capita GDP and is a major force in regional diplomacy. It's also been splashing the cash. Here in London, it owns the Shard, Harrods, Barclays. It also owns the football club Paris Saint-Germain. And the Qatar Investment Authority has $200 billion of assets in 30 countries. In a press conference, the new Emir said the country would take direction from no one and would seek to keep relations with all governments and states. The country played a prominent role in supporting the uprising against Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, and it continues to be one of the strongest backers of the rebellion against the Syrian president. But its actions abroad have not always been welcome, with protests against its so-called interference being seen in Egypt, Tunisia and Libya. So, is the country that will be the first Arab nation to host the Football World Cup the new power broker in the Middle East? What will the direction be under the new leader, and will it continue its stratospheric growth? Well, to discuss the issues surrounding this, I'm joined in the studio by George Eaton. He's the editor of the Staggers blog at The New Statesman. Also here in the studio is Paul Stock. He's an attorney and he's a former advisor to Qatar Petroleum. That's the state oil and gas company of Qatar. And on the line from Doha, I'm joined by David Roberts. He's a research fellow and director of the Royal United Services Institute. To you, David Roberts, in Qatar. I mean, what do we know about the new Emir?
The short answer is no. I mean, we've got vague ideas. So I think we can say that he's fairly well imbued with some of the key ideas that his father and mother have been pursuing all these years. We know he's very keen on sport. It's his investment group, the Qatar Sports Investment, which bought Paris Saint-Germain, not the state sovereign wealth fund, for example. But we just need to be a bit humble and wait to see, as opposed to trying to predict the unpredictable at the moment.
George Eaton, his father ousted his father back in 1985, so I guess the outgoing Emir knows a thing or two about how impatient princes can get. So this is preempting that, perhaps.
Yes, I mean, it was another bloodless coup, but I think we are, from the sounds, we're going to see more continuity than change, particularly given the economic uncertainty at the moment. I don't think the new sheikh is going to want to make any radical changes, but I think broadly the approach of trying to make sure that Qatar isn't too reliant on its oil reserves and extending investments abroad will continue.
Paul Stock, what do you think of the significance of the outgoing Emir's departure? It's very much a family business, isn't it?
I've been reflecting on this, and it's interesting that Hamad, the outgoing Emir, is 61. Tamim, the incoming replacement Emir, his son, is about 33. And Arab societies, and particularly these Gulf countries, and particularly Qatar, are very hierarchical. And the loyalty is to family, tribe, and then to the state. I'm surprised that it's happened now, because I would have thought that Hamad would have wanted his son Tamim to develop a little more. And I think there are probably two drivers behind this. One would be succession planning. The other, and this is purely speculative, is that it might be a health reason. If you see the former Emir, he's a large man. Many Qataris have some health issues, overweight sometimes, diabetes, too much sugar in their diet. There have been persistent rumours that the Emir Hamad had some sort of kidney issue. So it could well be, given that he's got 10 other sons, he wants an organised succession, and maybe he's decided to bring his son in 5 years earlier than he would have liked.
David Roberts, I guess it's unlikely that the media would be reporting those rumours about Hamad's health.
Well, those rumours, they float around Doha, but going back to, Al Jazeera, for example, no, you're right, they don't really cover them. I mean, that's not surprising. But at the same time, they are little more than rumours. In terms of the original question, I mean, there aren't really many parallels between the 1995 takeover that Hamid, when his father was out of the country, he took power in a bloodless coup then. His father bitterly opposed it and came back to the region, and with, local support at the time from Saudi Arabia, tried to unseat Hamid, and there's nothing like that kind of an atmosphere in Doha at the moment. It's been planned for, we think, quite a long time now. I mean, we are genuinely pretty puzzled as to the reasoning. The health issues are entirely plausible, who knows. But I mean, it's a few days after it now, we're all catching our breath a bit here in Doha. And Qatar never does what you expect. That's been the key issue of Hamad's rule of his 18 years or so. They've always done the unexpected, and so hindsight being 2020 and all that, it is, I suppose, inevitable that he was going to leave in an unusual way as well, perhaps to show his fellow leaders around the region, look, you can pass the power on. There shouldn't be this strange taboo over this issue. It can happen, and he's proven that it works relatively smoothly so far.
George Eaton, I suppose there is the possibility that this can be presented to the world and to his people as a change. It's not a democratic change, it's a generational change, but it's a change nonetheless, and perhaps that can preclude some kind of criticism of, especially with regard to the Arab Spring and countries surrounding him, which have sclerotic leaderships that age and fall apart before the eyes of the people.
That's right, and not least because Qatar has taken such a prominent role in aligning itself with the Arab Spring and with the rebellion in Libya and Egypt. But it is very much change within the framework of the existing system. In the short term, maybe enough to prevent rebellion or further unrest. But Qatar, it is easier to maintain authority in order, given how small the population is. And that is one of the advantages he has. And a large part of that population, of course, is migrants. And so you don't see the mass upsurge in discontent that you do in some of the neighbouring countries.
Paul Stock, do you see it as a response to the events of the Arab Spring, perhaps?
No, I don't actually. And prior to this programme, I was looking back at changes in Qatar, and it's interesting that Hamad introduced discussions about a constitution as far back as 2003. So clearly he is a forward-looking man. And, 8 years have elapsed since those constitutional changes. He's obviously decided that, there will be an orderly succession. The point George made is a very good one. The number of Qataris are actually quite small. Pure Qataris are probably about 250,000, 260,000 of them. They have a strong sense of national unity. And if you live in Qatar for a period of time, you see constant investment in schools, hospitals, roads. So people really are getting wealthier. The place is being developed, and they appear to have a very prudent royal family who don't go in for excessive consumption. And if you live in Qatar, you have a sense of stability.
And David Roberts, I suppose that sense of stability is key in the sense that you could argue the Arab Spring was due to some kind of economic disenfranchisement among the people of Tunisia, Egypt and Libya and so on. Qataris are incredibly rich. If there's only 250,000 of them and they have the highest per capita GDP in the world, they won't want to rock the boat. They'll want to see that growth continue. They'd want to see stability continue.
No, you're completely right. The economic component to the makeup here of how generally happy the people are with the way things are going, it's very, very important. You're exactly right. If things are going so well, why would you rock the boat? But equally, I think there are a couple of other things worth mentioning. The past 20 years have seen Qatar explode onto the international scene and all manner of cliches. It's particularly striking given just how non-existent Qatar was in many ways in the 70s and the 80s. Out with Qatar. From media in Al Jazeera, mediation in Darfur, in Lebanon, wherever. The Arab Spring is the latest incarnation of this, and we've had a very strong sporting push since the late 80s. So, I think people, Qataris at least, they're generally quite pleased with the trajectory of their country. It used to be known for pretty much nothing. Now, if it's known for anything, it might be known for, so to speak, saving the day in 2008 in the Lebanon Accords. It might be known for support of the Arab Spring. It might be known in a sporting context. It might be known potentially negatively, of course, supporting the Brotherhood or whatever. But overall, I think most Qataris are very pleased with the way things have gone, and this fits into their general contentment. And that's the reason as to why we've seen absolutely no large vociferous demonstrations at all for change, for elections. Most certainly, there have been a couple of people who have written a few things. There's a poet who's in jail who's going to be released any time now-ish, we think. It's not universal, of course it's not, it never is. But I really think it's the vast majority are quite content.
Paul Stock, the poet that's referred to there, he's been jailed for criticising the authorities, and it's written into the constitution of which you speak, not to criticise the authorities. What about is there a thirst for freedom of expression?
I don't think so as such. I'm not an Arabic speaker, and I'm sure on family dinners, the men eat separately from the women, when all the men get together behind the high walls of their complexes and mini palaces, I'm sure they discuss politics and they would have varying views. But one thing you do see is that Qataris are loyal to the concept of Qatar. So you never really have Qataris, no matter how close you get to them, telling you in English their criticisms of the royal family, the ruling family, or of the status of Qatar. Just occasionally you do get glimpses of it. For example, my wife used to be the chairwoman of a ladies' association who would meet twice a month, for about 200 or 300 of them, and they'd normally hire a conference hall in a major hotel. And each event they would have a guest speaker. And my wife told me that one day they were just settling down and a gentleman appeared. He was a professional, an architect. And he said, can I talk to you about a few things just for 5 or 10 minutes? And my wife, who was the chairwoman, agreed. To her horror, he then started to proceed to talk about corruption in Qatar. And he said, it's okay, the Emir has told me and encouraged me to speak out and it's right that I should do this. And I said to my wife after, I'm not entirely sure, that he's authorised to do this. And, all 200 of you could have ended up in jail. So I think there are people who criticise, but it's, behind the high walls, and you don't see evidence of dissent in Qatar, and, there's no formal opposition, there are no opposition parties. So, it does appear to be a very consensual country. And I think that George is right in the sense it's so small, it's easy to control. The point made by our colleague in Doha, basically, there is so much money about that, they can see their life improving. And if you look at the numbers, their gross domestic product is about $200 billion. If you divide that by the 250,000 Qataris, that's actually 750,000 each or something. It's a huge amount of money. So I think basically they're economically content, and there are no, as George pointed out, large urban poor proletariats who are dissatisfied, disenfranchised and causing trouble.
But David Robertson, Doha, it was interesting, one of the Emir's outgoing acts was to prolong the current advisory council. Does this cast doubts over the possibility of holding an election in 2014? What do you think of that?
I suppose it does in 2014. I mean, this is... we've been expecting elections for a long time. They've been promised for a long time by the Constitution. The Prime Minister and a couple of other leading characters have come out over the past few years saying that they will happen. And they will happen, but no one really knows when. Equally, Qataris, they're not particularly thrilled about the idea of elections. I mean, again, coming back to the region, I mean, this idea of why do we need elections? I mean, people look north up the Gulf to Kuwait and they see the mess that Kuwait is in and has been in for a long time now, because it's not exactly because of the elections, because that's the immediate cause, but it's because of the situation around it in terms of no political parties and all there's 1,000,001 issues. But it centres on elections. And so people just aren't particularly looking for them. It was his last decree, I think it was, but I haven't seen any particular reaction or concern about that.
George Eaton, there is certainly unhappiness towards Qatar from some of its neighbours. Bahrain, the UAE, for instance. They've been angered by Qatar's closeness to Islamist movements, to the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, a change of leadership here that we've seen this week, that won't make any difference to that alignment with those Islamist movements, will it?
No, I don't think Qatar has any interest in abandoning the position it's taken. Not least because I think most people think Morsi has been quite a canny leader so far for Egypt. I think now they've taken that position and they've taken some heat for it. There's no reason for them to climb down, and there is, of course, the possibility of further discontent. Food prices continue to fluctuate, and I think Qatar is quite well placed to take advantage of that.
I personally am slightly puzzled why, in the past 5 years, Qatar has given money to more radical Muslim groups. I think initially they gave money to the Palestinians, just some funding, and I think somehow they've gone slightly radical. And I was curious that previously they've been so inward-looking. I was quite curious that they actually, became involved in the Libyan situation and have views about Syria. So, their footprint is getting bigger. And I personally, if I were a sort of wealthy, well-educated Qatari, I would prefer Qatar to get on, with business as usual and not to meddle in these very complex peripheral events.
David Roberts, what's your view of that? I mean, what we have here is, I think the figure that I heard was $3 billion was the support Qatar has given to rebels in Syria. This has got to be of concern, certainly in terms of coming to some kind of resolution to the crisis. And the big debate here is obviously should Syrian rebels be armed or not? Should Qatar be getting involved to this extent?
Well, it's a very interesting topic. I mean, there's lots of ways you can look at it. I mean, in terms of why are Qatar getting involved? I mean, it's quite interesting to know the difference between domestic and international politics from a Qatari perspective. Internationally, Qataris seem not really to care, to be perfectly honest. There's no particular evidence that they are enormously pro or against any of the foreign policy decisions, aside from being generally happy. As I mentioned earlier, the 2008 Lebanon Accords, that went well. There were Qatari flags waved in Beirut. They're perfectly happy with that. But generally, it doesn't really cross their radar. Domestically, however, Qataris have a remarkable amount of say in many ways. I mean, we could come on to sort of worker rights and those issues, and one of the key reasons as to why Qatar is moving so slowly on that issue is because not only have Qataris who have their own sort of drivers and maids, and they don't want their control of them via the contracts to be changed, but we equally have the business lobbies here as well. And so they are controlling to some degree what the government do internally versus externally. But specifically on Syria, I mean, we need to remember what Qatar is. We've mentioned it's a country of around 250,000 people, but it's a very young country as well. It's not as if they have these great bureaucracies like we do. If William Hague wants to change British foreign policy, and he has a brainwave overnight, he'll put this idea into the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and the head department heads and the analysts and the lawyers will, rightly look at it, scrutinise it, pull it apart, put it back together. And if Hague was to suggest anything as outlandish as, intervening in Libya or Syria, as we're almost seeing at the moment, as a matter of fact, it would be pretty much quashed, I think. In Qatar, that kind of a parallel structure just doesn't really exist. If the Emir sees a crisis on the television and he feels it is incumbent upon him to intervene, it is done. That is Qatar's foreign policy made. And then it goes a bit down the channel. Then it's a case of from the strategic to the tactical of how we do things. And this is where some of the difficulty arises in terms of the going through with the policy, exactly how and who you support. I mean, one of my colleagues mentioned, this idea that Qatar is supporting ever more extreme groups. And I don't think this is a particular choice by the former Emir or the former Prime Minister, the former Foreign Minister. I don't think there was a conscious choice of, we need support of the moderate groups, whatever the phrase is. This isn't working. We need to up the ante. We need to support the more radical groups now. That doesn't strike me as plausible. What does strike me as plausible is a lack of control of specifically where the money is going. So the money goes across the Turkish border and then kind of disappears somewhere. And so that some Qatari money might end up spread around various different groups. That is entirely plausible. So all these issues are tied up with Qatar fundamentally as a state, as a young state with a small population.
And that money is also pouring in investment into the United Kingdom. And interestingly, Qatar has acquired a 26% stake in Sainsbury's, 20% stake in the London Stock Exchange, Chelsea Barracks site, US Embassy in Grosvenor Square. George Eaton, should we be worried about the relentless march of Qatari ownership in London?
I think we should be. Peter Mandelson, when he was the business secretary in the last government, put it quite well, and he said it's easier to take over a company or to take over an asset in the UK than in any other European country. I think there is a sense that you don't want to go back to the protectionism of the 70s of government picking winners or losers picking governments. But I think there is a recognition that the UK needs more of a national industrial strategy and one that favours British owners over foreign owners, because inevitably with greater foreign ownership of assets comes the potential to exercise political pressure. It's harder for the government to speak out against human rights violations, repression of free speech in countries such as Qatar, if they do have such significant investments in London. And you have here all of the leaders talking about a more responsible capitalism or more caring capitalism. And I think people do feel that the growth in Qatari investment in London is in some ways a symptom of an unbalanced model that's emerged has emerged over the last decade, and that they would like to see one that's less reliant on foreign investment and one that's more rooted in homegrown companies and owners.
Paul Stock, do you see a threat to this burgeoning Qatari ownership of the British capital?
No, not at all. I'm actually sympathetic to the point that George is making. Obviously you don't want a particular interest group to have such a high investment in an area of the economy that they can actually influence British policy. But I in a sense, I welcome the investment from Qatar into London. I welcome the fact that there are certain Middle Eastern states who have London as a reference point. Oman, Bahrain, Qatar. To some extent, if you've been watching the Royal Ascot, all these people from the UAE who invest in horse racing and stables. So I personally am an economic libertarian, and I welcome it.
We're talking about how there's only 250,000 Qataris and something like out of 1.5 million, 2 million people, mostly immigrants, mostly people from overseas. But David Roberts, can you see a potential brain drain to Qatar in the future from the United Kingdom? All the best educated, most talented people will go over there and leave the UK.
I suppose it's something to think about, something to discuss. But Qatar doesn't really have the size and the capacity to be a particularly big concern in that direction. In some ways, they're opening up a huge hospital complex called the Sidra teaching medicine and teaching school here in an education city where they've got all their foreign universities like UCL London, and so they're going to need thousands of nurses, and quite obviously the Qataris can't supply. Qatar as a country can't supply them, so it's entirely plausible that nurses from Britain might go there, for example. But more generally, there's just not the level of concern, the level of capacity here, to be a meaningful concern for the UK, I think.
And David, can I just ask you, in the last few weeks, Afghanistan's Taliban movement opened an office, its first office in the capital, Doha, to facilitate peace talks with the US, and also Doha's, of course, home to the a very prominent Islamic art museum. Do you see in future it could strike a balance between, I suppose, representing the Islamic world and not being not being seen as a sympathizer with Islamists?
You hit on a key point there. I think this is one of the key niches that Qatar wants. One of its key goals is to be seen as a centrally important, unique, niche interlocutor between the West, America, Britain, whomever, and these various problematic Muslim groups. Be this, in Darfur with the rebels there. Be this with, the Muslim Brotherhood across the new Middle East now, or of course the Taliban. I think that Qatar feel that there's a position for them there, that they are uniquely able to do these things. And again, going back to the question about Syria, why is Qatar doing it? It's doing it because it can. It feels fundamentally secure. There are very large American military bases here. It feels that its fundamental security is taken care of there. It has the money and it's certainly got the ambition to do these things. So it is doing these things. And so, in terms of the Islamic Art Museum, that's just about burgeoning Qatar as a soft power player in the region. There's lots of little examples like that in Doha. There's a whole area called Qatari where they've got an amphitheatre and all of these sorts of things, again, to try to make it a high-end tourist destination. I don't really think that comes into the nature of Qatar in terms of Islamic or not. It's about being a trusted intermediary between, as I say, the Muslim Brotherhood or whomever, and then Qatar's Western allies.
Paul Stock, there's also been a cabinet reshuffle. The long-serving Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Hamad bin Jassim Al Thani has been replaced. What do you think of the reshuffle? Do you think it makes any difference? Qatar, what will it mean in 5-10 years' time?
Qatar basically is run by the royal family, the Al Thanis, and I think one point we haven't made, which is very important, that they've been the royal family for 150 years, so they're completely accepted by the population. Completely accepted. There are about 5,000 in the sort of core of the Al Thani family. I think they will carry on. I personally feel that, I mentioned earlier stability, I think that they're in a stable state and they will remain so. I think they have two potential threats. Internal might be religious extremism. External would be Iran if for some reason the Iranians became discontented with the gas arrangements on the North and South Pass fields. I think the future bodes well for Qatar, which is why I made that question as to I'm puzzled why they are flirting with more radical groups, and possibly, as David pointed out, they're being drawn into it rather than it being a specific plan.
And George Eaton, do you think growth will continue and further investment from Qatar will happen in London?
I think almost certainly Qatar, as we've said, it has is now the richest country in the world per capita. It has those oil reserves at a time when the price is continuing to rise, and it is keen to exercise its economic muscle. It is growing at a time when so much of the world is contracting or stagnant. So it will of course take advantage to snap up assets at a time when it can do for a very advantageous price.
I'll give the final word to David Roberts in Doha. Can Qatar host a decent Football World Cup, do you think?
Eventually, yes, it can. It's making hard work of it at the moment. I went to Spain, Uruguay. It was a big jamboree here, at the start of the year, and I didn't get in until half time, and it's ridiculous. It boggles the mind. The Premier League and the Championship, we manage to get tens of thousands of fans week in, week out, yet they couldn't do this for once. On one occasion. But my grumbles aside, most certainly, all we need to know is, quite obviously the Qatari government will understand perfectly well that the eyes of the world are on them as never before, and therefore they will absolutely make, by hook or by crook, and using all the money on God's green earth, that they will make sure that it becomes a successful World Cup.
And the technology is being developed to make sure that players can play in those kinds of temperatures, yeah?
Yeah, it is, and there are quite some big British companies involved in that, but we're yet to actually work out whether it's going to be a winter or a summer World Cup. So the Qatari perspective is it's a summer World Cup, that's what we said. If FIFA come to us and say they would prefer it to be a winter World Cup, then the Qataris will oblige up until a certain point within the next, year or 18 months. That decision must be made. So, but in terms of which one it will be, I don't know yet.
Well, let's hope the England team gets sufficient hot weather training before that one. Well, I'd like to finish by thanking my guest. That's David Roberts, Research Fellow and Director of the Royal United Services Institute, on the line from Doha there. And in the studio, George Eaton, Editor of the Staggers blog for the New Statesman, and Paul Stock, an attorney and former advisor to Qatar Petroleum, the state oil and gas company of Qatar. Thank you very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, here on The Voice of Russia in London.
Sports investment, which bought Paris Saint-Germain, not the state sovereign wealth fund, for example. But we just need to be a bit humble and wait to see, as opposed to trying to predict the unpredictable at the moment.
George Eaton, his father ousted his father back in 1985, so I guess the outgoing Emir knows a thing or two about how impatient princes can get. So this is preempting that, perhaps.
Yes, it was another bloodless coup, but I think we are, from the sounds, we're going to see more continuity than change, particularly given the economic uncertainty at the moment. I don't think the new Sheikh is going to want to make any radical changes, but I think broadly the approach of...
It's in 30 countries. In a press conference, the new Emir said the country would take direction from no one and would seek to keep relations with all governments and states. The country played a prominent role in supporting the uprising against Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, and it continues to be one of the strongest backers of the rebellion against the Syrian president. But its actions abroad have not always been welcome, with protests against its so-called interference being seen in Egypt, Tunisia and Libya. So, is the country that will be the first Arab nation to host the Football World Cup the new power broker in the Middle East? What will the direction be under the new leader, and will it continue its stratospheric growth? Well, to discuss the issues surrounding this, I'm joined in the studio.
Trying to make sure that Qatar isn't too reliant on its oil reserves, and extending investments abroad will continue.
Paul Stock, what do you think of the significance of the outgoing Emir's departure? It's very much a family business, isn't it?
I've been reflecting on this, and it's interesting that Hamad, the outgoing Emir, is 61. Tamim, the incoming replacement Emir, his son, is about 33. And Arab societies, and particularly these Gulf countries, and particularly Qatar, are very hierarchical. And the loyalty is to family, tribe, and then to the state. I'm surprised that it's happened.
By George Eaton. He's the editor of the Staggers blog at the New Statesman. Also here in the studio is Paul Stock. He's an attorney and he's a former advisor to Qatar Petroleum. That's the state oil and gas company of Qatar. And on the line from Doha, I'm joined by David Roberts. He's a research fellow and director of the Royal United Services Institute. To you, David Roberts, in Qatar. I mean, what do we know about the new Emir?
The short answer is no. I mean, we've got vague ideas. So I think we can say that he's fairly well imbued with some of the key ideas that his father and mother have been pursuing all these years. We know he's very keen on sport. It's his investment group, the Qatar.
The new Emir of Qatar says he will continue to follow the path set by his father, who abdicated the throne earlier this week. In his first televised address as head of state, the 33-year-old Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani praised the efforts of the outgoing Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani in transforming Qatar from a Persian Gulf backwater into a diplomatic, financial and energy powerhouse. And what a transformation it's been. Its oil and gas supplies has meant it now has the world's highest per capita GDP and is a major force in regional diplomacy. It's also been splashing the cash. Here in London, it owns the Shard, Harrods, Barclays. It also owns the football club Paris Saint-Germain. And the Qatar Investment Authority has $200 billion of assets